Okay, thank you. So, when I first joined Intel in 2006, it was to help write a proposal for what then was to become a $36 million research centre called Trooll, Technology Research for Independent Living, and to build a digital health research capacity inside Intel. So I was hired by Intel to come on board for that. And I'll describe this centre a bit in a bit more detail. But again, kind of one of the things we tried to do was create multidisciplinary strands, a test bed, living lab approach, building about 650, working with 650 homeowners, with all the foibles of their lives and the environments that you might expect. From a technology perspective, things like thick walls, radio dead zones, shortage of space, electricity switches that get turned off at night and things like that. We also wanted to explore how to build smart homes for aging adults, find ways to keep people out of hospital and out of nursing homes for as long as possible. So whilst my colleagues, the clinicians and scientists in our centre began to work upon setting up their labs and clinics where our research populations would be characterised, myself and a small team of designers and anthropologists began a study called the Global Aging Experience. And this is where we went to visit many countries, visiting older adults, usually spending 2 days with them in each household, learning about the experiences and expectations of aging in different cultures and within different geographical areas. So just, you can see some of the things we looked at here, things, looking at their care networks, looking at their experience and expectations of aging, health and housing histories, their relationships with built and social environments, their availability and also perceived availability of different types of access to formal and informal care networks throughout the life course. So not just looking at a snapshot, but kind of thinking about how those might change over time and how they got access to different forms of health information. So what I'd like to do now is spend probably around 10 minutes going through a few vignettes, a few research case studies, and bring their voices into the mix. I think that's quite useful. So if you I'd like to you to indulge me with this. So we're going to start with a gentleman I'm going to call Giuseppe. Obviously, these aren't their real names. Giuseppe, at the time of research, was a 77-year-old man who lives in a small town in Tuscany. He lives with his sister in his own home, which faces a village square. It opens onto a beautiful garden. He had 2 hip replacements, and despite serious difficulties, including the need to use canes or a walker, Giuseppe makes a daily tour of the village square, often multiple times as a form of physical and mental practice. To keep going is the important thing, he told us. When the weather is so bad that venturing outdoors is impossible, Giuseppe walks laps around his dining room. At night, lying in bed, he dreams of a time when he can make it back down his back stairs to his garden, which he hasn't seen in 2 years. And he imagines every step, every place he would grab the handrail as he plots his route. Giuseppe quickly became a form of inspiration for us in several ways. Firstly, he reminded us to think in terms of aspirations and not limitations. Though he has been subjected to a progressive loss of mobility and requires routine medical attention, he sees himself in terms of none of these qualities. He still looks forward to being able to use his back stairs again. And it's the daily struggle to overcome his painful condition that gives him purpose. If technology is to truly serve people, it has to reach beyond the simply physical or even cognitive needs that are associated with aging and address the human desire for fulfillment and meaning. Whether this is found through looking after grandchildren, working in the garden, travel, volunteering, or continuing in the workforce, or simply Giuseppe's back stairs, this sense of purpose is incredibly important. Secondly, individuals such as Giuseppe help us think more clearly about specific technologies that we might put in the home. And we might think about some of the gait analysis prototypes. As we showed our engineering colleagues videos of people like Giuseppe in his home, they were struck by just how messy human locomotion really is, with walking sticks, walkers, or furniture surfing his way through the home, hanging onto corners of tables or the backs of chairs. older people with mobility impairment create a pattern on the floor that would confound the sensors that we were working on. And this is a good example of how real-world data informs technology design. Okay, the second vignette is a lady from Cork in Ireland, as many will know, I guess. It's again, at the time she was 92. And we went and we were interviewing her, and we often they would get guided around the house, etc. And Mary had a television upstairs in her house, in her bedroom, and it wasn't plugged in. And again, this is the type of thing that you have to spend some time and notice these things. And we asked her, why is that not plugged in? And she said, that's for when I get old. And then she went on and explained, that's for when I have to spend more time in bed. And this is both usual and unusual. It's usual in the sense that Mary doesn't think of herself as old. Of the hundreds of individuals that we've met during the course of our research, only a relatively small minority were willing to admit to being old. But Mary was unusual in that she was planning ahead for being less able-bodied. And this is something that many of we met don't do very much. Mary was interesting in another way, and it reflected a pattern we saw consistently through our research. She related her recent life history to us as a progression of meaningful events. The death of her husband, her retirement from civil service, her daughter's move from Dublin to Cork, Mary's own move from Dublin to Cork later, a few years later, after she'd had a fall. And she realised the need to be closer to her daughter and her grandchildren. And for her, this move really worked. And I think, but I've also interviewed many people where they've gone to live with their children, they've done a relocation away from their communities, their bedded networks, sometimes it can be very difficult, and they can find themselves very lonely. They might be living with their children, but they often don't want to intrude too much, so they will go and have dinner with the family. During the day, they're by themselves. In the evening, they try to retire early because they, want the family to have time themselves. So, it doesn't always work. Now, for Mary, it did. Mary was interested in another way, reflecting a pattern we saw consistently through our research. She related her life history to I think kind of another element we need to think about is that watershed events like these form a landscape not of gradual loss, but of rather periods of relative stability, punctuated with dramatic change. And this kind of pattern represents a tremendous challenge in terms of thinking about any kinds of intervention, technological or otherwise. If we wait until people recognize a need, we're going to be too late. So this question of how can we design technologies that not only develop and deliver value to people today, so they want to have them and to use them, but also these technologies that adapt to sometimes abruptly changing needs in the future. Okay, so our third vignette is Trini. And Trini lives in the south of Spain, not far from the city of Seville. And her home is in a second-story apartment in the village where she's spent her entire life. There's no elevator in her building, so she doesn't come down to the street very much, certainly not as often as she used to. And she has no immediate family. Her husband passed away a few years ago, and she's got no children. But she still has a network of people who care about her. And because she lives in a warm and beautiful part of the world, her windows are nearly always open. And this enabled a simple and highly effective system of what might be termed wellness checking. Trini, her niece, called up to her every day. "Can I bring you anything?" "Good morning, Trini," a local produce vendor called up to her. "How are you today?" I don't just listen to her words, the person told us later. I listen to how her voice sounds. If she's not well, I can tell by the sound of her voice. And this simple little routine is enacted millions of times a day in villages and neighborhoods around the world. And I think it's packed with insights about the values we need to build into our technologies. We need to think about technologies that support this community-based approach to health. The open window is a wonderful metaphor for thinking about how seamless and inconspicuous technology must become to actually deliver value in people's lives. Trini's niece and others in the community performed their monitoring in the midst of other valued social interactions in a way that was about as lightweight as one could imagine. And we must deliver technologies that are similarly embedded in the simplicity of daily life, that are meaningful both to seniors and those who care for them. Okay, so the last study I want to explore today, in terms of these vignettes that we're going to look from global aging, is a retired farmer who we're going to call Eric. I spent 2 days with Eric in Sweden, and he always stands out in my mind as a forcible reminder that even with some excellent public provision and instrumental home care, that this is not always sufficient. So Eric was widowed in 1997. He has a daughter with MS. Only 2 of his siblings are surviving. And Eric was a farmer. And he, like many farmers, he went through what I would call phased retirement. You know, he didn't stop farming straight away. It wasn't just a kind of work one day the next. He stopped kind of, he started selling off his outlying fields. Then he started kind of working on a market garden around his house. He had some bad falls. Found it difficult to walk down some of his steps, etc. And his life contracted. And by the time I came to see him, he was living in his big farmhouse, many rooms in there, but he was living within the bedroom, the kitchen, which had a big bench you can see behind here on this picture, and then the bathroom. And those were the heated rooms in the house. The rest of the house was just covered in dust sheets. So there's only 3 neighbouring households nearby. The neighbours do come by and check on him. As with many, this case happens so often, driving cessation, you're losing your driver's license, and for him this was a huge piece. When he lost his driver's license, he lost his independence, especially living in the countryside, no good public services near in terms of transport. So he was unable to go, a big part of his life was his work. Another big part of his life was going to a choir and singing in a choir. He could no longer do this. His confidence was shattered, really, but after these falls. He had a number of falls, some of them outdoors, and he did have, a pendant, and he did press it, and, sometime later, he called them angels, came and picked him up and got him back in the house, but his confidence was gone, and this is the point about loss of resiliency. His eyesight also was going. And so for him, he wasn't able to watch TV a lot. He found it gave him headaches after a time. So his daily schedule I've outlined here a little bit. He kind of wakes up. He wakes up because, yes, he has agricultural rhythms built into him, so he wakes up early anyway. But he's being forced to wake because he has cramps in his legs. He gets up, he dresses, he makes himself coffee. He's very proud of what he can do in the house. He has a neighbour brings him his newspaper. He has coffee then, and then waits for the Meals on Wheels people to come in, tries to have a bit of a conversation with them. Later then he waits for the nurse to come. Sometimes a home help will pop in, and the nurse will dress his wounds, etc. And then he listens to the radio a lot. His cat is his life. He has a cat that kind of he looks after. The plants behind him on the windowsill he looks after. And then he goes to bed very early. So I think kind of this reminded me that I think kind of, what are important to him, and the fact that he misses being able to go to work. I think kind of that during the second day of my visit was really kind of, I really learned a lot about him. I think sometimes you do need to go back, twice and have that time. It's not, you need to kind of really get to know people. And he began sobbing, and he showed me a letter rejecting his application to a care home. Many of the care homes have been closed down. They had, and I'm a huge advocate of independent living, but at this point, I think this gentleman should have been able to go to a care home. But I think this also shows us actually the consequences that if we can deliver certain services, but there are consequences, and very serious consequences, if we don't get companionship care right. So when we're thinking about aging in place, we need to be thinking about this. Bricks and mortar can be a wonderful site of memory. That's people want, they have memories there. But it can also be a prison. So we have to be thinking about how we can bring the home and the community into the home, people into the communities, and think about aging in place in terms of community in place. Okay, so these are aging in the community. So I think let's just bear that in mind. Technology can help in many ways, and I think it is starting to fulfill various promises. But it has, there's many things. There's such a long way to go in this journey. Okay, so we started late, so I don't want to kind of take up too much time from the later exercises. So I'm not going to probably go into all the smart cities work that I would have liked to, but I would like to kind of go through a few of the things that we looked at. So having spent pretty much kind of, a couple of years going around different countries, we came back and we spent some time trying to say, well, what were some of the key areas that we felt were very important? These would not be a surprise to many of you, but things like, supporting cognition and supporting physical activities, finding ways to bring healthcare home. We talked about that in terms of slaughter care, help getting care, enabling social interaction. I think this is a point I want to kind of take away today. People want meaningful and useful lives. These hundreds of interviews we did, this really came through. People want environments of choice. People want to feel safe in their homes, in their communities. This led us then into a whole range of what we would call deeper dive research projects here in Ireland. And some of these would have been around things such as transportation, mobility. Some would be around sleep and activity in social life. Some of it would be about mapping different pathways to care and people's perceived pathways, and trying kind of how they work through the labyrinth of bureaucracy. We had studies thinking about reinventing retirement. We looked at peer mentoring and supports, etc. I've had a long-term engagement for many years with the Third Age Foundation. Hopefully some of you are familiar with the Third Age Foundation. They've come up with many different services. They're a wonderful community of older people who they think about how to care for older people, and they also think about how older people can care for their communities. I think this is really very valuable. They've come up with all sorts of interesting projects, the senior helpline, going into schools and teaching skills like knitting, building knitting trauma teddies for children that go into ambulances. They developed this is social innovation. A group of people of older people who are social innovators. They developed a program called Faulty Shock, and that came about with an older person. One of these members was in a supermarket. She saw a migrant who'd recently moved to the village she was in, having trouble at the till with the English. She went and helped, and then she invited this lady to come into the Third Age Foundation on a Tuesday, and they met. And then over time, they started increasing that, and they created this program of teaching English, conversational English, to migrants. And this started in one village. I think this is now in maybe 300 villages around Ireland, and different 300 locations, community centres every Tuesday night. They have a curriculum all written out for them. It's now in New York, it's in Germany, etc. It's really spread. I think these things are things that we should really kind of look at and we should celebrate, I think, Okay, so Trooll itself, we set this up 2006, and initially it ran till 2012. What I kind of want to bring to this, because I think you've been looking at some design thinking pieces in the last day or so. This whole centre was kind of built around this idea of transdisciplinarity, of bringing different disciplines together, including design and skill sets, including design thinking, ethnography, etc., together with clinicians, together with designers, with psychologists, with engineers, bringing them all together to tackle and think about major challenges. And in this case, we had, a number of, we decided to tackle a number of things. We started with falls prevention, cognitive function, social connection, social and mental health, loneliness, etc. And I think this was a really great approach, but I think also what worked was that we didn't privilege any one particular discipline, and that's a real skill. It takes a lot of work to do that. And so, as I said earlier, we had clinicians who are helping us think through things, but we took the design way out of the hospital, and we went into the homes of people and tried to understand, the difficulties of kind of developing those, installing technologies, installing services, and thinking through services in those kind of more complex environments, or less well-defined environments, let's put it that way. This was the kind of method that we used. You've heard probably, I wasn't here yesterday, but I'm sure you heard about the fuzzy front end, and you heard about some of the different schemes. This will be a variation of this that we modified, really, because we wanted to kind of think about the front end of the diamond you might have heard about, but also we wanted to think about how you could then take the things that we developed, that we ideated, the prototypes we developed, and then move them into short and then longer term longitudinal studies. The kind of projects we're doing would involve things like risk and condition assessment research. And again, these would be things like, looking at falls risk estimation. This has now been spun out as a very popular company based at UCD. I was looking quite a lot with a chap, Brian Lawler, who many of you may know, looking at caregivers, companions, how to kind of survey ways of thinking about identifying and indexing psychological distress. We looked at chronic disease management and also cognition and kind of measuring that through voice analysis. And then some of the intervention research we looked at, some of the, we would be thinking in terms of, exercise models. Spend a lot of time looking at social connection, looking at social and emotional loneliness, different opportunities, to think about what kind of interventions worked, how to build on that. And also how to kind of engineer alertness and kind of train for focused living. So this kind of thing we were doing. And as I say, so that was during Trooll, and then in the latter stages, spent a lot of time also working with the School of Nursing at Trinity College Dublin, and I mean, some of that work was fantastic. And I suppose as we were going on and moving on to different projects after Trooll, I received a very kind invitation from my dear friend Mary McCarran, who I was delighted to hear yesterday that you'd won an Impact Award. I was very sad I couldn't make it because I was teaching until 6 yesterday, but and Mary and I kind of go way back, and so she I think kind of I think you really deserve that award. I really do. And she called me up in around 2013 and said, David, we really enjoyed the projects we've done together up to now. Would I come and be a visiting professor of healthcare innovation in the school? And I've spent several years. We set up the Centre for Healthcare Practice and Innovation there together, and did all sorts of interesting projects. Sometimes, like we worked on Optibirth and bringing ethnographic research into clinical trials. We worked on IDS Tilde and thinking about how to build accessibility videos, and and really, I mean, but she brought us on to say, how can we think about taking the research projects we're doing and exploring all the other forms of impact? The impact that really matters, the impact for the patients or the recipients or the caregivers, of services. So we did all sorts of things. We looked, this website is still going, steppingup.ie. And again, this came out of a HRB grant. The research was looking at how you can think about children transitioning to adult services, and many of them drop out of those services following transition. So how can we help them overcome some of the challenges that they're facing as they move to adult services? And one of the best ways to do that is to use stories, get people to talk through their experiences, to understand those experiences, and use them and help them become mentors for people going through those services. So that was the purpose of that design project that we did then. And also, similarly, this kind of idea of peer mentoring and community supports. We did this also in terms of thinking through the different elements of COPD following diagnosis. How do you kind of share information in different fashions? So what I'd like to do is finish up with a video. It's only a minute and a half of an amazing lady, Betty Sutton, who's going to talk through her experience of COPD. So, as a good anthropologist, I prefer that it's not my words. That it's sometimes better to give voice to others. So, I'd like to finish on that. So,
4 years after I was diagnosed, I was sent down to see a specialist and put on a rehab program down in. Can I mention the hospital?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, in St Michael's Hospital in Dunleary. And they run a very good rehab program for people with COPD. And that's where I learned all about, what it was and how it was caused and how to live with it. And I was absolutely devastated then when they discovered that I needed to go on oxygen. And I'm on oxygen now when I'm doing anything. But I try not to let it interfere with my life. I try to do as much as I can. I still go line dancing 3 nights a week. which when people look at me in amazement when I'm dancing on the floor with oxygen on me. But I can't stay on the dance floor for very long, but I do as much as I'm able. And when I done the rehab programme in the hospital, I discovered that the best thing for emphysema was exercise. So I go to an exercise class twice a week, and I still, as I say, line dance 3 nights a week. So I think I get plenty of exercise that way. And what for next after the diagnosis? But for 4 years, there was nothing done. I was just, the doctor says, you have emphysema. He gave me inhalers and said, basically, like, get on with it. That was it. There was nothing until I done the rehab programme and then discovered. And from the rehab programme, then I started a support group, because there was no support group for people with COPD in this country. And we started with 3 members, and now I have 40.